Welcome to Mr. Wongard's virtual lecture. Now, this lecture is just on the Enlightened Monarchs. The Enlightened Monarchs, in particular, what's interesting is yes, the Enlightenment era did not just only affect kind of the general populace or the educated elite. If anything, it also impacted those at the top of the power structure. We're going to focus on three monarchs in particular: Frederick the Great, Catherine the Great, and Joseph the Second. All three of these monarchs are going to try to implement enlightened ideas into their monarchy. Some more successful than others, but ultimately still trying to create these enlightenment ideals. Now, I'm going to ask you this question, and after I ask it, I want you to pause the video and kind of and ponder about it and try to answer it either on a notebook or in your head. But what policies may enlightened monarchs strive to implement, and what issues will they encounter in that process? So spend a minute, pause the video, and think about that question. All right. So thanks for answering that question. Let's look at some of the problems and policies they may try to implement. First, legal reforms. In Austria, in particular, a lot of the nobility kind of ran the legal system, and this created issues and class divide. As of course, the nobility who is running the legal system is going to enact policies and legal judgments that are going to benefit them. And it's also a slow process to have the nobility run it, as the nobility are all different. It's not one absolute power, it's many powers that are trying to enact their own beliefs and systems into the state. So the first thing these absolute monarchs that are enlightened are going to try to do is take over the legal system and expand their bureaucratic power into the legal system to ensure that there's one uh, code of law and that it's being implemented equally across the monarchy and the states, and also to reduce torture as well. Promoting education, also in Austria, you're going to see Joseph II try to implement public education, as he believed that if there's going to be an enlightened society, you need people to be able to read and educate, to understand that they have natural rights and liberties and other ideals like that, to ensure progress for the state in the future. Also, another one is religious tolerance. Now, many enlightened monarchs pushed for greater religious freedom, but at the same time, the only way to do that is to limit the power of the church. And in some places, this worked out. In other cases, not so much. And I'll give you those examples as we keep on going. Um, Also, economic reforms. It's now beneficial for these monarchs to modernize the economies through investing in key industries and key sectors of the economy. Also, to promote trade, okay, we're entering a globalized economy due to colonization in the Americas, and also seeing agricultural improvements, importing crops to have them grown in your territory rather than importing them from abroad. Now, what may be some of the problems? Some of the issues that they encountered could be resistance from the nobility. You're going to see that with Austria and Russia in particular. Public opinion. Okay, you're enacting new Enlightenment ideals. Not everyone's going to be on board with these Enlightenment ideals. Also, bureaucratic challenges. They're going to have to create their own bureaucratic system. Some of these monarchs are better at doing that than others. Sometimes it's hard to take over the institutions that were given to the nobility to power, and now they have to deal with that conflict. And also outside war. Um, we're going to talk about, well, we're not going to talk about, I'm going to briefly mention it. We're going to talk about the Seven Years' War and the War of Austrian Secession. Now, it's important that you read about the War of Austrian Secession and the Seven Years' War, as um, as they're kind of the big two wars within this particular unit. It's in your textbook readings. It's not a short. It's not a long reading, so I would definitely take the time to look that over. If you want to know the page numbers, that's on page 242 to 243 in our textbook. I would definitely take the time to skim that over. You might recognize one part of the Seven Years' War, and that is being the French and Indian War that took place right here in America. So please take a second to take notes on those wars. All right, let's talk about enlightened absolutism. So, as I said before, these monarchs are embracing some of the aspects of the Age of Enlightenment, but still are absolute in itself. Taking place in Central and Eastern Europe. Now, what's kind of ironic about this is they're almost encouraged to take advantage of these Enlightenment ideals. Why? It's because philosophes such as like John Locke believed that if you're going to have enlightenment policies in your government, in your states, it actually needs to come from a absolute ruler who's able to enforce such policies. So they believe that if there's going to be enlightenment ideals in society, it must come from one that has a lot of power. In this case, being an absolute monarch. The absolute monarch is the best way to ensure that natural rights were given and protected to the masses. Or else you might have a democracy or a mob, a majority that decides to go against natural rights or other abilities within the Enlightenment as well. So the three monarchs again that we're going to focus on is Frederick II of Prussia, Catherine the Great of Russia, and Joseph II of Austria. So let's talk about Prussia. Now, first monarch that you need to know about in Prussia is Frederick William I. Now, he starts the race to essentially centralize the states of Russia by establishing the General Directory. That's a basically a civil service ran um, government system that is able to supervise the central government, supervise the military, police, and also the government or the center of economic and financial affairs. By absorbing these four sectors into the monarchy, they're able to essentially rule a lot more easier within this bureaucratic system that Frederick William I, is creating. In this process, he's keeping a close watch on his civil service employees. So that's also seen as centralizing the state by expanding his royal outreach across the state. One way he's able to do this, is through a strict moral code. Interestingly enough, some of these ideas within the strict moral code is obedience, honor, conscience, and also surrendering everything except for salvation. So essentially, everything that's on earth, including the state, is extremely important to sacrifice. The only thing that you don't sacrifice is essentially God. But Frederick William I sees himself just right below God. So everything except for God must be given to the state. Now, how did Frederick William I kind of enact these centralizing policies with his new bureaucratic system? It's through increasing the power of the land owning nobles who happen to own serfs as well. And this is called the Junkers. They are unique in that they have a monopoly on the officer corps of the army, so a big part of the army. So if um, if William I wants to, you know, strengthen and centralize Prussia, well, he needs to get the Junkers on board. And the best way to do that is to tie them with the army through the officer corps. So now there's a close bond between the nobility, the army, and the monarchy, which creates a sense of servitude to the king and state from the Junkers. It creates um, very little conflict and a lot of peace within Prussia amongst these three classes, as they're all essentially self reliant or they're reliant upon one another, each of those factions. Now, even the Junkers within the officer corps also had their own essentially civil code, that being duty, obedience, and sacrifice. Now, you might kind of catch on, a lot of these um, civil codes are very militaristic, and that is a big characteristic of Prussia at large. Now, I'm going to ask this question. Where do we see this Prussian militarism be exemplified in the world in the 19th and also the 20th century? So I'm looking for two cases. So pause the video, think about it, and then I'll give you the answer. So the two places where you see this aggression from the Prussian military is in the Napoleonic Wars. One of the famous battles that Napoleon fights is called the Battle of Waterloo. In the Battle of Waterloo, if you're familiar with the movie on Apple TV of Napoleon, it's the one where Napoleon shoots his cannonballs into the ice to weaken the Prussian army as they're crossing on the ice. So many of them drown in the process. I would definitely watch that video on YouTube. It's very cool. Now, there's some debate on if it actually occurred in that way, but even if it did, or even if it did not, kind of the story of Napoleon's army stays true over time. Now, in the 20th century, where do you see that Prussian militarism? Well, you see it in World War One. Many of the main aggressors within World War One, yes, it was Germany, but more specifically, it was Prussia within Germany that was being the main aggressor for expanding their territory and weakening France and England. Um, they're kind of notorious for having pointy black hats, which during World War One was easy to create propaganda against, as it's kind of a little malicious or evil to have pointy metal hats when you go into war with skull caps on them. It's a little scary. So, but this is where you see the Prussian militarism starts. It's under Frederick William the First. Now, who takes over after? It's his son, Frederick II. Now, very well educated on Enlightenment ideals, loved Voltaire, even invited him to live in his court for almost 7 years. Now, very Enlightenment policy, he tries to create a single code of laws for his territories that eliminate the use of torture, except for cases of treason and murder, and also grants limited freedom of speech and press, as well as religious toleration. Now, it's important to note he didn't express religious toleration for all. He did enact some anti Semitic policies against Jews, such as making it hard for them to own a lot of land and barring them from taking on civil service roles that his father Frederick William I started to create when he started to centralize the state. So Jews were not allowed to be in those positions. He's also growing agricultural productivity as they're centralizing and people are now relying more on the monarchy. That is mostly seen through our favorite high calorie food, which is potatoes. He starts to import potatoes and starts to grow them across Austria as they're high on calories and is a good way to feed your populace. Now, Frederick the Great, of course, was aware of Enlightenment ideas against serfdom. Now, he couldn't really go against the serfdom institution that you see in Prussia, as the Junkers and therefore the army and therefore the monarchy, as they're all connected, are just too economically tied to the system. So while he was aware that it was bad in its nature and anti-enlightenment, he realized that there was no way rationally to actually go against that system. Now, just like his father, he is also trying to grow the army. He ends up growing it all the way up to 200,000 men, which for the time is pretty magnificent, and engages in those two wars that I really, really, really highly encourage you to read about again on page 242 to 243. The War of Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War. Okay. So let's move to Austria. Now, let's bring back the Habsburgs. Okay, Austria and Vienna are kind of seen as the Habsburgs dynasty center. But as Habsburgs have traditionally failed to do, they failed to centralize the states and provide common laws and for the populace. Now, Maria Theresa, Empress, tries to kind of recreate Austria, especially after losing Austrian Silesia to Prussia in the War of Austrian Succession. So she is striving now, after this loss, to strengthen Austria, to centralize Austria in response to this new enemy that they have, which is Prussia. So, first, if you're going to centralize the state, you need to enact better tax policy. So clergy and nobles now were to pay property and income taxes to royal officials rather than diets. Okay, diets, if you remember from Martin Luther, diets are essentially just a meeting space amongst public officials, in this case, public nobility officials. But that whole process of deciding in those diets of who pays taxes is long and usually not very effective. So this is a very strong way of enacting tax policies that will give more revenue to the monarchy. She splits up the territory of the Austrian and Bohemian lands into 10 provinces, all administered by royal officials. And this soon eventually gets taken over from her son, Joseph II. Now, he tries to create Austria to be even more enlightened, okay, while still trying to grow the prosperity of the state of Australia. Oh, sorry, Austria. I said Australia. Austria. He abolished serfdom, removed the death penalty, uh, established the principle of equality, okay, very John Locke, and advocated for public education and religious tolerance. Now, what this ended up really doing is it created essentially an alienation of the nobility and also alienation of the church, which has historically been very tied to the Habsburg dynasty, as the Habsburgs have just been historically Catholic. Now that he's allowing religious toleration, well, this is kind of a slap in the face to the Catholic Church. And also, um, he tries to enact strong kind of, I don't want to say nationalism, but in a way nationalist ideas by banning non-German uh, language in Austria. He wants German language to unite Austria together. In this case, though, it just alienates non-German speaking citizens. So Joseph II, while trying to enact Enlightenment reforms, essentially fails in a way. There's just too many components within Austria that disallow him to really take off on these Enlightenment ideas, um, which further creates suspicion of Joseph II, which makes him actually create a secret police to try to arrest anybody that goes against him. So, not very enlightened in that idea. All right, let's go to Russia and Catherine the Great. Very interesting figure. Now, Catherine the Great, who was wife of Peter III, which is the the grandson of Peter the Great, takes over as monarch after her husband was killed by a faction of the nobles. And she was in support of this murder of Peter III. Now, Catherine, an intelligent woman who was familiar with Enlightenment ideals and wanted to enact them into Russian society, really understood, though, her reliance on the palace guard and gentry class. Gentry being the land owning nobles, and also the palace guard kind of being the part of the nobility that is essentially in control of the I'm blanking in control of the stronger elite military force. Now, she started to question the institutions of serfdom. She questioned torture and capital punishment, but and also even advocated for the principle of the equality of all people in the eyes of the law. But kind of similar to Austria, they're just too tied to the nobility that there's no way that she's going to get rid of serfdom, as the gentry essentially relies upon this institution of serfdom and fails to enact any removal of such a system. Now, just like Austria, she tries to divide Russia into 50 provinces with subdivisions, with nobles ruling over them. She favors this class of land owning nobility and starts to really give them a lot of legal power. Now, as you said before, she was trying to get rid of eventually the institution of serfdom. But after she tries to actually grant some freedom, this led to the nobility pushing back, which then leads to the Pugachev rebellion. Now, what is the Pugachev rebellion? Um, the Pugachev rebellion is essentially a rebellion by free peasants that to try to enact or go against the oppressive taxation and land policies that were put onto the peasants by the nobility, and also to get rid of military service. Now, this leads to a manifesto that promises these elimination of taxes and military service, but this fails as the government systems and forces soon stop the rebellion, kidnap Emelian Pugachev, uh, torture him, murder him, and essentially stop the rebellion. So this did not last long. But Catherine the Great was also successful in expanding Russian territory westward into Poland and southward to the Black Sea and in Ottoman territory, as long as Russia agreed to protect the Russian and Greek Orthodox in those Ottoman territories. So we talked about how Russia gains parts of Poland. So Poland was historically really weak. They had a monarchy, but the monarchy was essentially a shadow ruler, a shadow puppet for the nobility in Poland that was essentially ruling. Now, when you have the nobility ruling, it usually leads to a weaker state, and this is a good example of that. With civil war between these noble factions and Russia trying to enact their policies within Poland, it led essentially to the collapse of Poland. Poland was separated into three parts. Um, Germany, or sorry, Prussia, gaining the westward part of Poland, Austria, the south, and then Russia in the east. Okay. So overall, what is kind of the aftermath of why these Enlightenment monarchs burnt out? Well, essentially, nations became just more conservative and more politically repressive against any opposition. So these monarchs fade. Kind of the big ending story, Frederick the Great of Prussia grew isolated with age, and his heir reversed many of his reforms as the country's going more conservative. Joseph II of Austria, his reign was short, and he turned to censorship and the secret police when criticism built. And Catherine the Great of Russia, while the peasant uprising led to fears of social and political movements within Russia and created a lot of class tension. Okay, now this is uh, my last slide. Please, please, please read about the wars tied to these monarchs. It could be on the test on Thursday, so it is crucial that you spend time going through that. All right. Well, I'll see you on Wednesday. We'll do a little test prep, but also a little art activity. See you guys then. Bye.